The growing China threat update for mid-February 2023. War clouds. War clouds are looming. On October 12th of 2022, Chief of Naval Operations Michael Gilday said, "What we've seen over the last 20 years is that China has delivered on every promise that they've made earlier than they promised to deliver." Gilday added that when we talk about war, we talk about a 2027 window. But in my mind, it has to be a 2022 window or a 2023 window. I can't rule it out. On January 30, a top Republican in the U.S. Congress stated that he thought the odds of a conflict with China were very high. And this was after General Mike Minahan made a comment that caused consternation in Washington. Mike Minahan was referring to a memo that Mike Minahan released on February 1st, or dated February 1st, and released on January 30th, where Mike Minahan, who is the Air Mobility Commander, wrote to his roughly 110,000 members, the leadership thereof, that my gut tells me we'll fight in 2025. On February 2nd, U.S. Central Intelligence Agency Director William Burns said that Chinese President Xi Jinping's ambitions towards Taiwan should not be underestimated, despite Xi being likely sobered by the performance of Russia's military in the Ukraine. Burns said that the United States knew as a matter of intelligence fact that Xi had ordered his military to be ready to conduct an invasion of Taiwan by 2027. Now, nobody can be unaware of the recent balloon flights over the United States. In particular, about 2 weeks ago, the Chinese sent what they called a weather balloon, but what we know without doubt was in fact a surveillance balloon, across the United States to surveil and take pictures and collect radio intelligence over sensitive military installations in the United States. The Biden administration on February 10th added 6 additional Chinese entities that are connected to the surveillance balloon to an export blacklist. These restrictions come after the White House said that it would consider broader efforts to expose and address China's larger surveillance activities that threaten the United States' national security and the security of our allies. The Commerce Department said that the 5 companies and 1 research institution were supporting China's military modernization efforts, specifically the PLA aerospace programs, including airships and balloons. Washington must commit more diplomatic and security resources to the Indo-Pacific region to push back against China as Beijing seeks to create a regional sphere of influence and become the world's most influential power, said Senate Foreign Relations Committee on February 19th. The Senate Foreign Relations Committee, which is composed primarily of Democrats, issued their report almost exactly a year after the Biden administration released its strategy to modernize alliances in the region, strengthen emerging partnerships, and invest in relationships. On Thursday, February 10th, the Chinese Communist Party responded to a proposal by the Biden administration that a ban be imposed on Chinese citizens buying property in the United States. The Foreign Ministry of China claimed that the United States is violating the principles of a market economy and international trade rules in considering this ban. Mao Ning, a spokesperson for the Chinese Communist Party, said generalizing the concept of national security and politicizing economic, trade, and investment issues violates the rules of a market economy and international trade. Interestingly, foreign citizens can only own 1 residential property for dwelling purposes in China. They are not allowed to purchase other types of real estate, such as farmland, and this is currently the kind of thing that Chinese citizens are purchasing throughout the United States, specifically farmland near military installations. On February 12th, House Oversight Committee Chairman James Comer, Republican from Kentucky, said on Sunday that China steals billions of dollars worth of U.S. intellectual property and maintains a massive spy ring in the United States and U.S. institutions. Comer argued during an appearance on ABC's This Week that the problem of Chinese surveillance was a lot bigger than spy balloons floating over the country. Comer bashed President Biden for allowing China's crafts to cross the continental United States, but said the failure of the Biden administration to combat intellectual property theft was really the true issue. On February 11th in Berlin, the head of Germany's domestic intelligence agency said that he fears that China is expanding its spy activities against Berlin. He said in a newspaper interview published on Saturday, adding that Beijing was focusing increasingly on political espionage. He said China is developing wide-ranging spying and influencing activities. We must be prepared for these to increase in the coming years. Asia-Pacific alliances. On February 1st, the Speaker of Taiwan's parliament, during a forum for international religious freedom that was held in Washington, D.C., stressed the importance of defending the island's democracy in the face of pressure from China. In an address to the International Religious Freedom Summit, Mr. Yu Sikun sharply criticized Beijing's suppression of religious minorities and described Taiwan as the only democracy in the Chinese-speaking world. On February 7th, in Taipei, Taiwan announced that it will speed up the development of drones for military use, taking into account the lessons of the war in Ukraine and the threat that's posed by China, the island's defense ministry said. Unmanned aircraft have played a crucial role on both sides since Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February of last year. Taiwan has learned lessons. Further, U.S. companies in Taiwan are making contingency plans amid the increased China tensions. Almost half of companies surveyed by the American Chamber of Commerce in Taiwan are revising or plan to revise their business continuity plans amid the tensions with China, while a growing number reported being impacted by these strains. China, which views democratically governed Taiwan as its own territory, has been stepping up military drills across the Taiwan Strait since U.S. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi visited Taipei in August of 2022. On February 3rd, Micronesian President David Panulo said that Micronesia aims to soon sign an extension of its economic and security pact with the United States, a deal seen as important in Washington's efforts to counter Chinese influence in the Pacific. Micronesia is one of 3 Pacific Island states that has so-called compacts of free association with the United States, which allows Washington exclusive access to airspace and territorial waters in exchange for financial assistance. You can see where Micronesia is with a red dot, very small island group. On February 1st, the United States announced that it opened an embassy in the Solomon Islands after a 30-year absence as it seeks to boost diplomatic relations with the Pacific Island country as a counter to China's growing influence. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken announced plans to open a diplomatic mission in the Pacific Island nation during a visit to the region last year. The last U.S. embassy in the Solomons closed in 1993 amid post-Cold War budget cuts, and the United States was represented there by an ambassador based in Papua New Guinea. On February 11th, the United States and Papua New Guinea have announced that they've made substantial progress on the text of a defense cooperation agreement that lays the groundwork for closer military ties between the two nations. Negotiators from the U.S. State Department and from Papua New Guinea's Department of Foreign Affairs met in Honolulu, Hawaii on Monday, February 11th to discuss a defense cooperation agreement. In Manila, on February 2nd, the Philippines granted the United States greater access to its military bases, their defense chief said, and amid mounting concern over China's increasing assertiveness in the disputed South China Sea. The United States would be given, or will be given, access to 4 additional locations under the 2014 Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement. This was announced by U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin and Philippines Defense Secretary Carlito Galvez. On February 6th, the Philippine Coast Guard announced that it's stepping up its presence in the disputed South China Sea by deploying additional vessels and conducting more sorties and overflights in freedom of navigation exercises to protect maritime territory and the country's fishermen. Beijing's sweeping claims of sovereignty over the waterway has drawn repeated complaints from Manila, which has ramped up its rhetoric against reported Chinese construction activities and the swarming of Chinese vessels in the resource-rich waterway. On February 8th, Philippine President Ferdinando Marcos Jr. arrived in Japan for a visit expected to pave the way for closer security ties with Tokyo. This is as Manila is increasingly siding with the United States in its regional tussle with China. Marcos and Prime Minister Fumio Kishida are expected to deepen cooperation in humanitarian assistance and disaster relief as a possible precursor to establishing a broader legal framework that would allow Japanese forces to deploy to the Philippines more easily. The next day, Japan said that it was looking to strengthen joint military exercises with the Philippines as the two U.S. allies on Thursday pledged to forge closer security ties at a time of heightened tensions with China. The maritime nations also penned a deal to allow their armed forces to work together during disaster relief operations. On February 3rd, China firmly objected to the further cooperation between Britain, the United States, and Australia on nuclear submarine building and deployment. Chinese Foreign Minister spokesman Mao Ning said, "China is gravely concerned about this and firmly objects to it." This was in response to a question that cited a media report saying British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak's visit to the United States in March may yield announcements on more nuclear submarine cooperation. On February 8th, outside of the Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada, the U.S., Britain, and Australia conducted joint air maneuvers and drills as part of an ongoing effort to simulate high-end combat operations against Chinese fighter aircraft and other air defenses. This is part of a larger coordination effort between these alliance partners to mitigate the growing Chinese threat in the Southeast Asian area. On January 30th, it was reported that China's Coast Guard drove away Chinese fishing vessels from waters that are disputed in the East China Sea. The disputed East China Sea islets, claimed by both China and Japan, have long been a sticking point in bilateral relations. China calls the islands Diaoyu, while Japan calls them Senkaku. China Marine Police spokesperson Gan Yu said the Shinsei Maru and 4 other Japanese ships illegally entered the territorial waters of the Diaoyu Islands before being driven away by Chinese Coast Guard vessels. Is it no wonder that Japan is increasing its defense spending significantly? Japan's prime minister in December has asked his cabinet to secure enough funds to raise defense spending to 2% of GDP over the next 5 years. This is increasing the defense budget significantly. Fumio Kishida told Finance Minister Sunichi Suzuki and Defense Minister Yasukazu Hamada during a meeting that Japan needs to urgently increase its defense budget by fiscal 2027. On February 5th, Washington suggested deploying medium-range missiles in Japan as part of a plan to bolster defenses against China along the East and South China Seas, the Sankei newspaper reported. The deployment of U.S. forces in Japan may include long-range hypersonic weapons and Tomahawk cruise missiles, the newspaper reported, adding without citing sources that Tokyo is poised to start serious discussion towards accepting the deployment. On October 7, 2022, the Biden administration published sweeping export controls, including a measure to cut China off from certain semiconductor chips that are made anywhere in the world with U.S. tools. This vastly expanded the U.S. reach in its attempt to slow Beijing's technological and military advances. The rules, some of which went into effect immediately, build on restrictions that are sent in letters earlier in the year to top toolmakers KLA Corporation, Lam Research, and Applied Materials, in effect requiring them to halt shipments of equipment to wholly Chinese-owned factories producing advanced logic chips. The measure effectively shuts down the Chinese advanced chip production and assembly industry, making it extremely difficult for China to compete in that industry with the United States. The longer-term implications are that Chinese weapons will begin to fall further behind the U.S. in terms of processing power and speed. On January 30, the Biden administration stopped approving licenses for U.S. companies to export most items to Huawei, one of China's major technology companies, according to people that are familiar with the matter. Huawei has faced U.S. export restrictions around items for 5G and other technologies for several years, but officials in the U.S. Department of Commerce have granted licenses for some American firms to sell certain goods and technologies to Huawei. In 2022, Qualcomm received permission to sell 4G smartphone chips to Huawei. On January 31st, a Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson, Mao Ning, expressed serious concerns, about a report that the United States had stopped approving licenses for U.S. companies to export items to Huawei. We are closely following relevant developments, he said. China's semiconductor industry has become a key target of the United States, which has imposed a slew of export restrictions targeting several parts of the country's chip sector. While Beijing has plowed vast sums of money into cultivating a domestic chip industry, its fabrication plants still heavily rely on foreign-made equipment that they in turn use to turn slabs of silicon into chips and power hardware. An American official on Tuesday made the most direct comments by a U.S. authority to date, acknowledging the existence of a deal with Japan and the Netherlands for those countries to expose new restrictions on exports of chip-making tools to China. We can't talk about the deal right now, Deputy Commerce Secretary Don Graves said on the sidelines of an event in Washington, but you can certainly talk to our friends in Japan and the Netherlands. On January 31st, the White House announced that it's launching a partnership with India that President Joe Biden hopes will help the countries collectively compete against China on military equipment, semiconductors, and the development of artificial intelligence technologies. Washington wants to deploy more Western mobile phone networks in the subcontinent to counter China's Huawei technologies and to welcome more Indian computer chip specialists to the United States and to encourage companies from both countries to collaborate on military equipment such as artillery systems. On February 4th, Japan's government announced that it will begin restricting exports of advanced semiconductor manufacturing equipment to China after it amends a foreign exchange law to allow for this change to take place. Japan and the Netherlands have agreed to join the United States in halting shipments of semiconductor manufacturing equipment produced by the likes of the Japanese company Nikon Corp and the Netherlands ASML Holdings. This is in a bid to stop China from developing advanced chips that could be used to enhance its military power. Also on February 4th, the United States announced it's considering new sanctions on Chinese surveillance companies as a result of sales made by China to Iran's security forces. U.S. authorities are in advanced discussions on the sanctions and have zeroed in on Tiandi Technologies, an electrical equipment manufacturer based out of the Chinese city of Tianjin, whose products have been sold to units of Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. On February 9th, the Biden administration announced it's poised to introduce new restrictions on U.S. companies funding the development of advanced computing technologies in China. The United States last year published a sweeping set of export controls, including a measure to cut China off from certain semiconductor chips made anywhere in the world if they're made with U.S. equipment or personnel. On February 10th, the Biden administration announced plans to outright ban investments in some Chinese technology companies and to increase scrutiny of others. These are part of a plan to crack down on the billions that American companies have poured into sensitive Chinese technology sectors. The ban is expected to apply to some investments tied to chip production. The upcoming rules are likely to track sweeping new restrictions the United States placed on exports of American artificial intelligence chips, chip-making tools, and supercomputers to China in October of last year. That concludes our update on the growing China threat for mid-February 2023. Thank you for watching.